A drone hovers low over cracked, sun-baked mud where open water used to be. Below it, a shape moves. Long, deliberate, cutting a straight line through a shallow pool that shouldn't exist anymore. The clip is only 11 seconds long. It has already been reposted thousands of times, and nobody watching it agrees on what they're actually looking at. This is what's been circulating out of Lake Okeechobee, Florida's largest freshwater lake, as months of drought have pulled its water level down further than most residents have seen in years. The footage is real in the sense that the lake really has dropped. What's underneath the surface and what that shape in the video actually is a different question. And it's the one this story is going to try to answer honestly, without pretending there's more certainty here than there actually is. To understand why one blurry clip out of hundreds of hours of drone footage over this lake managed to spread the way it did, it helps to understand what Lake Okeechobee actually is, what it's been through before, and why a body of water this large has spent nearly a century being treated less like a lake and more like a piece of infrastructure that happens to be full of wildlife. Start with what isn't in dispute. Lake Okeechobee sits almost dead center in South Florida, a shallow, saucer-shaped body of water covering roughly 730 square miles, big enough that from the middle of it, standing on a boat, you can't see land in any direction. Despite its size, it's remarkably shallow. Average depth across the lake is only about 9 feet, closer to a flooded parking lot than a typical lake, which means even small changes in water level expose enormous amounts of lakebed that are normally invisible. Locals sometimes call it the liquid heart of Florida. And the description isn't just sentimental. The lake genuinely functions like a heart in the state's water system, receiving inflow from the Kissimmee River watershed to the north, holding it, and then pumping it back out through canals and rivers to the south and east, depending on the season, the rainfall, and the risk of flooding. Every drop of water that moves through it affects drinking supplies, farmland, and wetlands hundreds of miles away. That single fact is easy to forget when you're staring at 11 seconds of drone footage, but it's the reason everything downstream of this story, literally and figuratively, matters more than the clip itself. That lake sits inside one of the most heavily engineered water systems in the country. After a catastrophic hurricane in 1928, sent a wall of lake water over its low southern banks and killed an estimated 2,005. 100 people in a single night. The Army Corps of Engineers built the Herbert Hoover Dike, a 30-foot-tall earthen wall now stretching more than 140 miles around the lake's perimeter. Ever since, the Corps has managed Okeechobee's water level deliberately, releasing or holding back water depending on rainfall, drought conditions, and flood risk, keeping the lake within a target band that's been adjusted and renegotiated for decades. That 1928 disaster is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the quiet backdrop to almost every strange story that's ever come out of this lake since. Entire farming communities along the southern shore were wiped off the map in a single night. And because so many of the dead were migrant laborers whose names were never properly recorded, official casualty counts have always been treated as rough estimates rather than precise figures. Survivors described a lake that simply stopped behaving like a lake, rising, spreading, and swallowing roads and homes faster than anyone could run. That single night is part of why any story about Okeechobee revealing something buried tends to land with more emotional weight here than it would at a smaller, quieter lake. This isn't just water. It's water with a body count, and a century of engineering built specifically to make sure it never repeats itself. Recently, that management has collided with a genuine, well-documented drought. Rainfall across South Florida has run behind normal for 2 consecutive wet seasons, and lake levels have fallen accordingly, down to readings not seen in over a year, edging close to the point where navigation locks around the lake have to close because there simply isn't enough water to operate them safely. That part of the story isn't speculation. It's tracked daily in feet and inches by the same agency that built the dike protecting the communities around the lake. Picture what a few feet of drop actually means at this scale. Because the lake is so shallow and so flat, a 4-foot decline doesn't just shrink the shoreline by a few yards the way it might on a deep mountain lake. It can pull the water's edge back by hundreds of yards in some stretches, turning what used to be prime fishing water into open, sun-cracked flatland almost overnight. Boat ramps end in dry mud instead of water. Marinas that were built assuming a certain minimum depth suddenly find their docks, stranded well above the waterline. It's the kind of change that's gradual on paper, a few inches a week, but visually dramatic in person, which is exactly the condition that produces both real ecological stress and viral footage in the same season. And that's exactly the condition that produces footage like the clip now spreading online. When a lake this shallow drops even a few feet, it doesn't just shrink at the edges. It exposes vast stretches of lakebed that have been submerged, undisturbed for years or decades. Mud flats appear where boats used to pass. Old creek channels, invisible under normal water levels, suddenly become visible again. And anything that had been living, hiding, or simply resting in that deeper water gets concentrated into whatever smaller, shallower pools remain. That's the setup. Now here's the part that made this specific footage take off. The video shows a section of newly exposed lakebed, still holding a shallow residual pool after the surrounding water receded. Something in that pool is moving in a straight, purposeful line, disturbing the surface enough to be visible from drone height before the footage cuts. There's no clear size reference. There's no clean shot of whatever's making the disturbance. And that absence of a clear answer is precisely why the clip spread the way it did. Vague footage invites the viewer to fill in the blank themselves, and the blank got filled in dramatically fast. So, what could actually produce that kind of movement, given everything we know about what lives in and around Lake Okeechobee? The most mundane explanation is also the most statistically likely one: an American alligator. Okeechobee has one of the densest alligator populations of any lake in Florida, and receding water levels are a well-documented trigger for increased alligator movement, as animals that are used to deeper water relocate toward whatever pools remain. A large alligator moving through shallow water at speed produces exactly the kind of long, straight surface disturbance visible in the clip. No fins breaking the surface, no visible head, just a wake. Wildlife officials in the region routinely note upticks in alligator sightings during low water periods for precisely this reason. It's worth pausing on why alligators behave this way, because the mechanism itself is almost more interesting than the sighting. Alligators are ambush predators built around patience, and patience depends on cover, enough depth and murk to stay hidden while waiting for prey to come close. When a lake drops several feet, that cover disappears fast. Deeper pockets that used to offer safety become shallow puddles, where every movement is visible from above. Alligators respond by traveling, sometimes overland, sometimes through connecting canals, searching for the next pocket of water deep enough to hide in. That travel is exactly what produces sightings like this one. An animal that would normally stay submerged and still is instead crossing open, shallow water in full view, because the alternative is staying exposed in a puddle that's shrinking by the hour. A second, equally mundane possibility: gar. Florida's lakes, Okeechobee included, host large populations of longnose and Florida gar, an ancient armor-scaled fish species that can grow to several feet in length and is known for cruising just beneath the surface in shallow, low-oxygen water, a behavior that becomes more common, not less, when a lake's water level drops and dissolved oxygen becomes scarcer in isolated pools. A gar that size, moving with intent through 6 inches of water, can absolutely produce a disturbance dramatic enough to make an 11-second clip look uncanny. Gar are also one of the oldest fish lineages still swimming in North American waters today, essentially unchanged in body plan for tens of millions of years, which gives them an almost prehistoric silhouette, even in good lighting. In murky, disturbed water, exactly the kind kicked up by a drone's own shadow passing low overhead, or by the animal's own movement through soft mud, a gar's long, torpedo-shaped body can look considerably larger and stranger on camera than it would in a clear, still pool. That's not a criticism of anyone who found the footage unsettling. It's simply how that particular species tends to read on low-resolution aerial video, especially without a size reference nearby. A third possibility takes the story into more current, more uncomfortable territory: invasive species. South Florida's waterways are now home to an expanding population of Argentine black and white tegus, large ground-dwelling lizards capable of swimming, and to Burmese pythons, whose range has crept steadily northward from the Everglades over the past 2 decades, as the climate and available prey have shifted in their favor. Neither species is confirmed in this specific footage. Nobody has produced a clear identification, but both are now documented, established parts of the region's ecosystem, and both are capable of producing exactly the kind of long, low, surface-disturbing movement this clip shows. The invasive species angle matters beyond just explaining one video, because it points to a slower, less cinematic transformation happening across this entire region. 20 years ago, a python sighting this far north of the Everglades would have been treated as a fluke. Today, wildlife agencies run organized removal programs specifically because the population has become established, breeding, and expanding rather than incidental. A drought that concentrates wildlife into smaller pools doesn't just make native animals more visible, it makes these newer, less expected residents more visible, too, which is part of why so much unusual wildlife footage out of Florida in recent years carries this same unresolved, "we're not totally sure what that was" quality. There's also a stranger, less biological possibility worth taking seriously, precisely because Okeechobee's history makes it plausible: submerged debris finally becoming unstuck. The lake's bed has been accumulating material for nearly a century: sediment, vegetation mats, and, in isolated documented cases, wreckage tied back to the 1928 hurricane and to decades of agricultural and construction runoff that settled into the lake basin. When water levels drop and pressure on the lakebed changes, waterlogged debris that's been anchored in soft sediment for years can shift, tilt, or briefly float free before resettling, producing a disturbance that from above can look uncannily like something alive, without a living thing being involved at all. Even vegetation plays a role here that's easy to overlook. Okeechobee's bed is home to thick, sometimes decades-old mats of submerged and floating aquatic plants, some of it native, a great deal of it invasive species like hydrilla and water hyacinth that have plagued Florida's waterways for generations. As water recedes, these mats don't always dry evenly. Pockets can remain waterlogged and buoyant longer than the ground around them, occasionally breaking loose and drifting across a shrinking pool in a way that, filmed from directly above with no ground-level reference, can look remarkably like slow, deliberate movement, even though nothing living is directly responsible. None of these explanations require anything exotic or unexplained. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's not the answer clickbait titles are built to deliver. The honest state of the evidence right now is this. The lake is genuinely measurably lower than it's been in a long time. The footage genuinely shows something disturbing the surface of a shallow, isolated pool. And the most likely explanations, alligator gar, invasive reptile, or shifting vegetation and debris, are all mundane, all previously documented in this exact lake, and none of them have been confirmed for this specific clip, because nobody has published a clear follow-up shot, a size reference, or an identification from a wildlife biologist. That gap between something moved and here's exactly what it was is where speculation rushes in, and it's worth understanding why that rush happens so predictably. A vague 11-second clip, stripped of context, activates the same instinct that's kept humans cautious around murky water for our entire evolutionary history. If you can't identify what's moving beneath the surface, assume it's worth worrying about until proven otherwise. That instinct isn't irrational. It's exactly why alligator attacks, historically rare per capita, still dominate local news coverage disproportionately to their actual frequency. The brain treats ambiguous movement in water as a threat category first, and asks clarifying questions second. Zoom out, and the drought itself is the more consequential story sitting underneath the viral clip, even if it's less dramatic. A shrinking Lake Okeechobee isn't just a curiosity for drone footage. It's a genuine strain on an entire regional water system. The lake supplies drinking water infrastructure for millions of South Floridians indirectly, feeds the Everglades restoration effort that depends on carefully timed water releases, and serves as the primary flood buffer for a low-lying region that has already, once in 1928, paid the cost of that buffer failing catastrophically. Every foot the lake drops changes calculations for agriculture, drinking water utilities, and the ecological restoration projects downstream that were designed around a lake, staying within a specific operating range. It also changes the exposed habitat in ways that ripple outward. Newly bare lakebed dries, cracks, and in some sections becomes colonized quickly by invasive vegetation before the lake refills. Altering the underwater landscape, animals return to once water levels recover. Fish and wildlife that concentrate into shrinking pools become easier prey for birds and larger predators, temporarily reshaping the local food web. None of that requires a mystery creature. The drought alone is already doing enough to the ecosystem to explain unusual animal behavior and unusual sightings without needing anything stranger than biology under stress. So where does that leave the footage that started this? Genuinely unresolved, in the most literal sense. Not because the explanation has to be extraordinary, but because nobody has yet gone back to that exact pool with a clear camera, a size reference, and enough patience to get a clean look at whatever was moving. That's usually how these stories end in the real world. Not with a dramatic unmasking, but with the footage aging out of relevance before anyone circles back to finish the investigation. The lake keeps dropping or refilling depending on rainfall. The clip keeps circulating, increasingly disconnected from its original context. And the actual explanation, almost certainly alligator, gar, an invasive reptile, or shifting debris, sits there, plausible and unglamorous, waiting for nobody in particular to confirm it. What the footage does capture accurately, whether or not the specific creature in it is ever identified, is a genuine shift happening across one of the most important bodies of water in the country. Lake Okeechobee's level has always been a story about engineering, rainfall, and risk far more than it's ever been a story about mystery. But shrink any lake far enough, and it stops looking like infrastructure and starts looking like something older. A place giving up whatever it's been hiding, one exposed acre at a time. Most of what surfaces will turn out to be exactly what biologists would predict. A little of it, for now, gets to stay unexplained a while longer, which raises the only question worth ending on. The next time a drought pulls a familiar lake down to levels nobody's seen in years, and something in the newly exposed shallows starts moving in a way that doesn't match anything you expected, Do you wait for someone to go back and get a clear shot, or do you let the blank space in 11 seconds of footage answer the question for you?